Hi everybody, welcome to our first PowerPoint of this unit, the chemistry of our bodies. So a lot of this should hopefully be reviewed from physical science, but some of it will probably be new or just in more detail than you're used to. We're going to start by going over some basic info. So first of all, you may be wondering, wait a minute, this is biology. How does chemistry even relate to biology? Well, chemistry is the study of matter, and everything's made of matter, including you. The nucleus of an atom, which makes up matter, contains protons and neutrons. So a quick refresher, protons is a positive, neutrons, we're just going to do 0 for neutral. Electrons then are located outside of the nucleus, and if you remember, electrons are negative. Elements then are composed of atoms, so elements are the simplest form of a substance, and they're all arranged in a periodic table. So how to read the periodic table then? Well, we have an atomic number, a symbol, an element name, and an atomic weight. So the atomic mass or the atomic weight is the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus of that element. How do we calculate neutrons then? You're going to take the mass number. Okay, so iron here is our example. So you take the atomic mass, you subtract the number of protons, which is actually the atomic number, and then your resulting number is your number of neutrons. And if we also remember, the atomic number is your protons and your neutrons. So in hydrogen, for example, there's 1 proton and 1 neutron. So the human body, there's some major elements that we're going to focus on. So those would be, in order of how often they are in your body, oxygen, which is the most plentiful, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and then sulfur. There are lots of other elements in your body as well, but these are the 6 that we're going to focus on. Well, you may be wondering, what do all these elements even do for me? Well, here you see a list of the functions of those elements. So oxygen is really important for converting your food that you eat into energy. Carbon is essential to our body. It's the major building blocks of our body. It's also really key for testosterone and estrogen. Hydrogen helps transport nutrients, remove waste, and keep your body temperature even. Nitrogen is an amino acids, which make up proteins. It's also part of your DNA. Phosphorus helps your bones and teeth, and it's also essential in ATP, which is how you also get energy for your cell processes. And lastly, sulfur is found in lots of things in your body. So cartilage, insulin, breast milk, immune system proteins, and keratin. Well, now that we've talked about elements, let's talk about molecules versus compounds. So a molecule is where atoms are held together by covalent bonds, but a compound is when 2 or more different elements combine. And this can only be broken apart by a chemical reaction. So how do we determine then what is in a compound? So when we're given the following compound, HBr, we want to know, first of all, what elements are in this compound, and second of all, how many of each element are there. So take a moment and pause and see if you can answer this. Well, hopefully you got hydrogen and bromine as your elements, and then there's just one of each in this compound. Let's practice a little bit more. So pause here and answer the 2 questions that go with each compound. Hopefully, for the first one here, H2O is water. So what elements are in here? We have hydrogen, excuse my terrible writing, and oxygen. And how many of each? There's 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. Below, we have iron oxide. So what elements? Fe is iron, O is oxygen. Ooh, that's bad, sorry. And how many of each element? So we have to do a little multiplying here. So 7 times 2, there's 14 iron, and 7 times 3, there's 21 oxygen. So now that we've talked about what's in compounds, let's talk about the chemical equations. So the arrow itself is indicating a process of change from the reactants to the products. So now we also need to understand how to balance these out. So the elements have to be equal on each side. And a little note, you can never change the subscript numbers. So these little numbers down here, you can't change those. You can only put numbers in front to equal them out. So if we do this here, we see that we have 2 hydrogen on the left, 2 hydrogen on the right. Well, that's good, right? They're equal. but we have 2 oxygen on the left and only 1 on the right. So to get 2 oxygen, we need to place a 2 here. But now that just made how many hydrogens? 4, right? So now we need to put a 2 over here, giving us 4 hydrogens and 2 oxygens on the left, 4 hydrogens, 2 oxygens on the right. All right, now it's your turn. I want you to pause here and write all 3 of these equations down in your notes and then solve them. All right, are you ready to check how you did? So our first equation here, all you had to do was put a 2 in front of the HCl. The second equation, you needed a 2 in front of the Mg and then a 2 in front of the MgO. And the third equation, a 2 in front of the H2 and a 2 in front of the H2O. So chemical bonding, we've talked a little bit about the reactions. Let's talk about when they bond to form chemical compounds. So there's 2 types of chemical bonds that you need to know. There's covalent bonds, which is when they're sharing. Think the prefix co, like cooperate, you share, right? Whereas ionic bonds are when electrons are either lost or gained, depending on which one you are in the bonding. There's also something that's pretty important to biology, and that's hydrogen bonding. So hydrogen bonding is actually just an electrostatic attraction between 2 polar groups, and it only exists when hydrogen's bonded to an atom with a very high electronegativity, such as oxygen, for example. Well, you may be thinking, why are these even important? Hydrogen bonds are super important for properties of water, which help all living things survive, as well as in proteins, and it's what holds the DNA double helix together. Now that we've talked about bonding and water and all of that so far, let's get into pH. Hopefully you remember that the pH scale goes from 0 to 14, and then 7 is neutral in the middle. So water is typically what we think of when we think of something that's neutral, and then acids are anything below 7, and bases are anything above 7. This also might be new to you, but it's important to note that acids are releasing hydrogen ions when they're in a water solution, whereas bases are releasing hydroxide ions, or OH, in water. This is also important to our bodies, right? So pH is a really important component of our bodies functioning properly. The human body pH is actually slightly basic at 7.4, but if this pH changes too much, our enzymes don't work properly, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So you may be thinking, why is our pH above neutral 7? Well, our body has lots of acid-forming processes, and in addition, as a human species, we tend to overconsume acidic foods, so our body kind of works with that by having a pH over time that is slightly grown to above 7. Also, important to note that too much acidity in your body can be linked to diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. Foods that you eat then are either acid-forming or alkaline-forming after you digest them. So acid-forming foods break down as acidic, and alkaline-forming foods break down as basic. Like we said, if you have too much dietary acid, it can lead to problems with your body. And the reason for this is that minerals and proteins are borrowed from your body to help neutralize this acid. And that comes from your bones and muscles. So that can cause a lot of problems later on in life. So water is what we typically think of when we think about physical reactions. And this is relating to things like a texture change, a shape change, or a state, solid, liquid, gas of water. Water is super important for our bodies. Our body's actually made of roughly 60% water. Babies, believe it or not, are made of almost 78% water. So gradually as we get older, we have less water overall in our body. And there's 4 essential purposes for water in the body. So cell structure and function, chemical metabolic reactions, nutrient transport, waste removal, and then really important to regulate our body temperature. Now let's talk about chemical reactions. So chemical reactions are things like a color change, an energy change, a precipitate. So burning is a really common example of a chemical reaction. And when we talk about chemical reactions, they're typically expressed via energy diagrams. So they're going to show how the energy changes over the time of the reaction. And we'll get into these a little more in class, but there's exothermic and endothermic reactions depending on whether heat is given off or heat is gained during the reaction. Activation energy then is just the energy required for the reaction to begin. So you see it surrounded in blue boxes here. It starts with wherever the reactants are, and then however much it takes them to get up that hill to the end or the products. Enzymes then are super important because they help lower the activation energy, which allows reactions to function more efficiently. So you can see the light blue with the red line is without an enzyme present in the reaction, and then the dark blue line is with an enzyme present. So if you were running up a hill, which hill would you want to run up, right? The one with the enzyme, because it's going to take less energy to do so. So enzymes are proteins, but they're also super special because they're known as catalysts for our body, and they help increase how efficient our reactions run. So they speed up the reactions and they lower the activation energy. However, people commonly have a misconception that they increase the amount of product and they get used up, which is not the case. Our body, on the other hand, really, really likes enzymes, and we have some special ones that help us function at our best. So we have hydrolases, which are digestive enzymes. This helps us break down things like carbs and proteins. So amylase it breaks down starch, which is a complex carb, and pepsin helps digest proteins. We also need enzymes for DNA replication, and don't worry, we spend a whole unit on this, but they help DNA make copies of itself. We also need metabolic enzymes, which helps the body make energy and do certain processes. So during cell respiration, for example, there are enzymes in each step, which helps us convert food to energy. You can also have enzyme deficiency. So probably the one that you're most familiar with is that of lactose intolerance. So your body has typically an enzyme called lactase, which breaks down lactose, which is the sugar in milk. But if you have lactose intolerance, you're missing this enzyme or you don't have very much of it. There's also things called pancreatitis, which means you have a deficiency in digestive enzymes leading to your pancreas getting inflamed. And then a disease called Tay-Sachs disease is actually a defective enzyme that children can be born with that makes their brain swell up and typically results in early death in childhood. So super sad. It's also important to remember that the structure of an enzyme determines its function. So the word denatured is something you need to be familiar with because a denatured enzyme's shape has been changed. So for example, if you were to boil an enzyme that only functions best at lower temperatures, you're going to change that shape and then change its function, and then it can no longer do what it needs to do. So the following are things that can denature enzymes. So we talked about heat. There's also extreme pH. So your enzyme has a specific pH. So your stomach has enzymes which function best in a highly acidic environment. If you put them somewhere else that's not that low pH, they're not going to function. You also have strong chemicals. So enzymes themselves work best under an optimum pH, but that is enzyme specific depending on where that enzyme is located and what it does. Lastly, we're going to quickly review types of solutions. So we have a solvent, which is what does the dissolving, and a solute, which is what is being dissolved. So I always remember this, that U comes before V, so U goes into V. So solute goes into solvent, and then it makes a solution. So two types of solutions: homogeneous solutions, which is a uniform composition throughout. And the prefix homo means same. So if you remember that homo means same, so the solution, no matter what sample you take, is going to be the same. On the other hand, you have a heterogeneous solution. So this solution has distinct components. So you see two examples here, or like trail mix, for example. You can typically re-separate something like that out, but you also, when you look at it, you can tell that it's many different components. And that is all for your video notes.